All right, let's set the record straight. When you think Viking, what comes to mind? Horned helmets, raiding monasteries, and smelling like a compost pile after a thunderstorm? Well, surprise! That last one? Totally wrong. Despite what pop culture says, Vikings were not medieval swamp monsters with hygiene habits that could kill crops. In fact, compared to most of medieval Europe, they were downright sparkling. So, in today's video, we're diving nose first into the surprisingly advanced world of Viking hygiene, their grooming tools, bathing routines, scented oils, and even how they handled lice. We'll also compare them to other societies of their time and answer the big question: were Vikings really cleaner than the people they raided? Grab your combs and prepare for some serious soap talk. Let's kick things off with the Vikings version of a bathroom drawer, and trust me, it's not what you'd expect from a bunch of sword-swinging seafarers. You'd think someone living in the 9th century, battling the elements and raiding coastal villages, wouldn't care much about personal grooming. But the truth? Vikings took hygiene seriously. We know this because archaeologists have been finding Viking grooming kits all over Scandinavia and the British Isles. And they're not rare finds either. These things show up in graves. Imagine being buried with your favorite tweezers. That's the level of importance we're talking about. Let's break down what was in a typical Viking toiletry kit. First up, the comb, the MVP of Viking grooming. These combs were usually carved from antler or bone, sometimes even wood, although organic materials like wood don't preserve as well. The craftsmanship was next level. Some combs were so finely made they'd rival modern plastic ones, except these were beautifully symmetrical, often decorated with patterns and fitted with cases to protect the teeth. We've found them in places like York, in England, then called Jorvik, where over 130 combs have been discovered in Viking Age layers. That's a lot of hair care for a so-called dirty culture. Combs were considered essential, and some were worn on the belt, proudly displayed like a badge of hygiene. Today we flex with Apple Watches. Back then? Check out this elk antler comb, engraved with runes and imported from Denmark. Now let's move on to tweezers. Yep, Vikings plucked. Tweezers made of iron or bronze have been found in both male and female graves. They were used to remove stray hairs, possibly for cosmetic reasons, but also practical. Hair could get caught in helmets, cloaks, or just look plain unruly. In Norse society, being disheveled wasn't rugged. It was seen as low status. Next item, razors. These weren't the safety razors you find at the pharmacy. Viking razors were usually small, curved iron blades, sometimes shaped almost like folding knives. Some even had carved handles. Men were expected to keep their beards trimmed and their necklines neat. A clean-shaven neck was considered tidy. An unkempt beard? Not a good look unless you were a berserker trying to scare someone in a tavern. Then we've got nail cleaners, which were usually small tools with a flattened edge, sort of like a cuticle stick. Vikings worked with their hands, blacksmithing, rowing, sailing, farming. Dirty fingernails weren't just unattractive, they were impractical and possibly dangerous. Clean hands could mean fewer infections, although they didn't know it in microbiological terms. They understood the value of cleanliness. And now, let's talk about the most legendary item in the Viking grooming arsenal, the ear spoon. Yes, ear spoons were a thing. Tiny tools, often carved from bone, with a small scoop at the end, used for, earwax removal. While it might sound gross now, these were common across several ancient cultures. But Vikings? They were early adopters. These were sometimes attached to grooming kits worn on a ring or chain, kind of like a medieval keychain of hygiene. Imagine a Viking warrior reaching for his sword and accidentally grabbing his ear spoon. Wrong fight, buddy. All these tools weren't just utilitarian. They were status symbols. Many were elaborately carved and placed with care in graves. The fact that people were buried with them tells us they weren't considered trivial. Grooming was part of identity, And Norse sagas even mention grooming as a way to prepare for battle or festivities. A warrior didn't want to enter Valhalla looking like a troll who hadn't bathed since Ragnarok. And here's the kicker. These tools were found in both men's and women's graves. Grooming wasn't gendered in Viking culture. Everyone was expected to look presentable. Men might have trimmed beards and oiled hair. Women might have braided their locks and plucked their brows. These practices helped define beauty, dignity, and even honor in society. One stunning example comes from the Oseberg ship burial in Norway, dated around 834 AD. This burial included the remains of two high-status women. And among the grave goods, comb fragments, tweezers, and cloths, all carefully laid out. It wasn't just about death, it was about appearance, dignity, and being clean in the afterlife. You know what they say, can't storm the gates of Valhalla with dirty ears. So the next time someone tells you Vikings were dirty barbarians, ask them how many grooming kits they think a barbarian needs. Because the answer apparently is several, with carved antler accessories. All right, brace yourself for a plot twist that's about to scrub away centuries of stereotypes. Because believe it or not, Vikings were not the crusty, unwashed wildlings of legend. Nope. They had a bathing schedule. A what? Yes, a bathing schedule. Let me introduce you to Laugardægar. That's Old Norse for washing day. It's where we get the modern word Saturday. That's right, the Vikings literally built a day of the week around taking a bath. One day a week, every week, just for washing up. Honestly, that's more regular than some roommates I've had. But here's the wild part. They didn't just tolerate bathing, they actually enjoyed it. Bathing was part of social life, routine life, even ritual life. And depending on the region and the time period, some Vikings bathed even more frequently. In Iceland and Norway, where geothermal activity is abundant, hot springs were often used as natural spas. Picture this. After a long day of tending sheep or rowing a longship across the North Sea, you and your crew hop into a hot spring, steam rising, muscles relaxing, scrubbing the road dust out of your beard. Like an ancient Viking spa day with less cucumber water and more birch branches. And speaking of birch branches, enter the sauna. Yes, those cozy steam rooms that we associate with Finland, their roots go back to Viking Age Scandinavia. Saunas were heated by burning wood in a fire pit, filling the room with steam, and then, get this, people would sweat it out, beat themselves with branches to improve circulation, then plunge into ice-cold rivers or snowbanks to cool off. Step aside, CrossFit. Viking wellness culture was already crushing it. Now here's where it gets really interesting. Compared to the rest of Europe, the Vikings were positively sparkling. Let's do a little hygiene comparison, shall we? In Anglo-Saxon England, some folks bathed. Well, at least once in a while. But for the most part, bathing was seen with suspicion, especially by the clergy. The logic went something like, clean body equals temptation equals sin. Seriously, some monks believed dirt protected you from evil thoughts. Try using that excuse the next time someone tells you to shower. And in medieval France, things got downright grimy. Public bathhouses started to decline around the 14th century due to fears of disease. Louis XIV, the Sun King himself, ruler of the most powerful European kingdom of his time, was rumored to have only bathed twice in his life. And I mean full baths. He was more of a change your shirt and dab your face with perfume kind of guy. Meanwhile, the Vikings were over in Scandinavia like soapstone, birch branches, scented oils. Let's do this. Oh, and yes, they had soap. Not the fancy perfumed stuff you find at artisanal markets today, but lye-based soap, often made from animal fat and wood ash. Harsh, sure, but highly effective at removing dirt, grease, and, well, enemy blood if the day had gone particularly Viking-y. In fact, many Viking soap fragments have been found at excavation sites, especially in places like Dublin, York, Jorvik, and Hedeby. Some soap was even perfumed with herbs like thyme or yarrow, which added antibacterial properties and a nice scent. Let's not forget, Vikings were often guests in other cultures, mostly uninvited, but still, and their reputation for cleanliness traveled just as fast as their longships. English chroniclers complained that Viking men were stealing the hearts of Anglo-Saxon women because they were better groomed, better dressed, and bathed more often. Imagine being defeated by a guy who not only raided your town, but looked better doing it. Even the Arab traveler Ibn Fadlan, who met Viking traders along the Volga River in the 10th century, remarked on their cleanliness. He was horrified that they all shared a communal bowl to wash their faces and blow their noses into the same water, which is admittedly disgusting. But he also observed that they washed daily and combed their hair meticulously. So yes, the methods might seem strange to us now, but in the context of medieval Europe, the Vikings were practically the cleanest guys on the continent. All right, so the Vikings bathed regularly. They had combs, razors, and even ear spoons. But here's a question that's probably already on your mind. What's the point of cleaning your body if your clothes still smell like a goat pen? Well, good news. Vikings weren't just scrubbing themselves down, they were washing their clothes too. And they took that business seriously. Let's start with the materials. Most Viking clothing was made from wool and linen, two fabrics that, fun fact, are naturally odor-resistant, breathable, and durable. Wool especially is a kind of miracle fabric. It insulates when wet, repels dirt, and doesn't hold stink the way synthetic stuff does today. And you better believe the Vikings understood how to keep those textiles clean. Laundry day was real in Viking-age Scandinavia. Now, did they have Tide Pods? No, but they did have an unexpected secret weapon. Urine. Yep, let me introduce you to the ancient detergent nobody wants to admit works. Stale pee. Historical fact time. Urine contains ammonia, which breaks down oils and stains. The Vikings would collect urine, often referred to as lant, and use it to soak clothes before rinsing them with water. It was their version of a pre-wash cycle, and weirdly, it worked. Before you gag too hard, remember, ancient Romans did this too. In fact, Roman laundries were taxed for collecting urine in jars from public urinals. And centuries later, the Vikings were carrying on the noble, smelly tradition of chemical cleaning with whatever they had on hand. Do you smell ammonia? That's the smell of clean. Now, once the soaking was done, the clothing would be rinsed in fresh water, often in streams, rivers, or even collected rainwater, and laid out to dry in the sun, which also acted as a natural disinfectant. Sunlight helped bleach linens and kill bacteria. And they weren't just washing their clothes out of necessity. Cleanliness had social meaning in Viking society. Looking neat, wearing well-maintained clothes, it signaled respectability, discipline, and readiness. Whether you were preparing for a Viking legal assembly, a feast, or a raid, showing up in clean clothing mattered. We even have some solid archaeological evidence of Viking textile habits. In excavations of Oseberg, Hedeby, and Birka, archaeologists have discovered textile fragments, some of which were dyed, woven in complex patterns, and even pleated. These weren't ragged survival tunics. These were high-effort garments, and someone had to clean and maintain them. Let's also not forget the importance of linen underwear. That's right, Vikings often wore linen underclothes beneath their wool tunics. Linen is easier to clean, more breathable, and could be swapped out more frequently. It's basically the Viking version of keeping your base layers fresh. And get this, laundry was most likely a communal activity, especially for women. Women were responsible for maintaining the household, which included textile production and upkeep. So you can picture Viking women scrubbing, soaking, rinsing, and hanging clothes to dry while chatting about family news or the next trading voyage. In fact, Norse mythology even reflects this emphasis on textile work and cleanliness. The goddess Frigg, Odin's wife, was associated with domestic chores, including spinning and weaving. Clean clothes weren't just about appearance, they were tied to values of order, care, and social harmony. So, yeah, while your medieval French knight was spraying himself with rose water to cover up the fact that he hadn't washed his tunic in a month, a Viking farmer was probably beating his woolen cloak clean on a rock by the fjord. And they didn't just stop at clean clothes, they mended them too. Needlework was common, and patches were a sign of resourcefulness, not poverty. Vikings weren't wasteful. If you wore something into battle and survived, you patched that thing up and wore it to dinner. So the next time you picture a Viking raider stepping off his longship, don't imagine a wild-eyed barbarian in blood-stained rags. Picture a guy with clean linen underclothes, a hand-washed wool tunic, and a beard combed so neatly he could charm the earl's daughter by just raising an eyebrow. All right, so the Vikings bathed, they washed their clothes, and they had better grooming kits than some of us today. But here's where it gets really impressive, because they didn't stop at just being clean. They wanted to smell good too. Yeah, Scandinavia's most feared warriors were also into fragrances. Historical sources and sagas mention that Vikings were fond of using scented herbs and oils. These were typically made from locally available plants like birch, juniper, pine, yarrow, thyme, and angelica. These weren't just for smell, they had practical uses too. Juniper, for example, has mild antiseptic properties, so it smelled good and kept you from getting an infection. Talk about efficiency. And they didn't just splash it on and call it a day. Oils were often massaged into the beard and scalp, especially by men who wanted that classic flowing Viking look without the dry, itchy flakiness of helmet hair. That's right, Bjorn wasn't just fighting Saxons, he was fighting dandruff. And this wasn't all vanity, there was cultural importance to being well-groomed. According to multiple Norse sagas, unkempt hair or a messy beard was a mark of shame. In the saga of Njal, characters insult each other by calling out greasy hair and tangled beards. An insult like, "You haven't combed your beard in weeks," was basically calling someone a slob and a savage. You just didn't walk around greasy if you wanted to be taken seriously. Now, let's talk beards. Because if there was one thing Viking men loved more than sailing and silver, it was a well-maintained beard. Beards were a symbol of masculinity, age, and wisdom. And maintaining a beard wasn't passive. You didn't just let it grow wild and pray it looked majestic. Men trimmed their beards with razors, those small iron ones we mentioned earlier, and shaped them into styles that were fashionable for their region or social rank. We know this from written sources and artistic depictions. Some went full Gandalf. Others rocked the short, well-sculpted look. The point was, the beard had a look, and it took work. We also have evidence from grave finds in Norway, Denmark, and England that beard combs and grooming items were sometimes found inside decorated cases, often with other luxury items. These weren't tools you tossed in a drawer, they were displayed, cherished. Beard pride was real. And if someone dared mess with that beard, look out! There's one story from Norse lore where a man's wife cuts his beard while he sleeps. A serious violation. When he wakes up, he's so humiliated he divorces her on the spot. It's not just hair, it's honor. Moral of the story? Don't mess with a Viking's beard while he's napping. As for perfumes and colognes, there's no Viking equivalent to Old Spice, but they use scented smoke and incense, especially during feasts and rituals. Some burned aromatic herbs over coals to infuse their clothes or cloaks with a smoky, earthy scent. There are even references in runic poems and saga literature to the use of fragrant oils before heading to important social events, things like law gatherings, courtship rituals, and formal feasts. If you wanted to impress, you showed up clean, cloaked, combed, and smelling like a fresh pine grove. In fact, when Anglo-Saxon chroniclers complained about Viking invaders stealing their women, part of the blame was placed on the Vikings' obsessive grooming. According to 11th century sources, the Danes combed their hair every day, bathed every Saturday, and changed their clothes frequently. Scandalous! How dare they be well-groomed and charming? Even travelers from distant lands noticed. Ibn Fadlan, the 10th century Arab diplomat who encountered the Norse along the Volga River, had a lot to say about their habits. He found some customs strange, like communal washing bowls, but he was clearly impressed by how meticulous they were with their grooming. He noted that they combed their hair every day and often adorned themselves with jewelry, arm rings, and clean garments. These guys weren't just warriors, they were image-conscious, style-aware, and fully invested in beard oil centuries before it became a hipster essential. Okay, so far we've painted a surprisingly refreshing picture of Viking hygiene. Weekly baths, scented oils, beard maintenance worthy of a grooming channel. But let's not romanticize it too much. Because as clean as the Vikings tried to be, they were still living in the medieval world, surrounded by things that crawled. Let's start with the most infamous Viking roommates, lice. We're not guessing here. Lice combs are one of the most common finds in Viking settlements and graves. These weren't flimsy little throwaway tools either. These were carved from bone or antler, finely toothed, and sometimes beautifully decorated. That's right, decorated lice combs. If you're going to hunt parasites in your hair, might as well do it in style. Archaeologists have found these combs in Viking-age layers from York, Jorvik, Dublin, and even Birka in Sweden. Some were worn on the belt like a fashion accessory, ready for a quick grooming session whenever the itch struck. Just a moment, lads. Before we raid, I've got to delouse my scalp real quick. The fact that lice combs are so widespread tells us two things. Lice were absolutely a problem. Vikings actively dealt with it, and they likely did it together. Scholars believe communal delousing sessions may have been a social thing, especially among family members or between couples. Picture it, sitting around the hearth, passing the comb, flicking lice into the fire. Cozy, right? Now onto the other nightmare fuel, intestinal worms. Yup, they were just as much a part of Viking life as axes and ale. How do we know this? Because archaeologists love digging through ancient poop. No joke. Viking latrines, also known as privy pits, have yielded coprolites, fossilized feces, which are kind of like time capsules for a person's gut health. In places like Coppergate in York, they've found coprolites full of whipworms, roundworms, tapeworms, you name it. These parasites thrived in environments where even the cleanest person could get infected through contaminated water, undercooked meat, or unwashed hands. So yeah, you could have freshly scrubbed skin, a gleaming comb, and a beard that smells like pine oil, and still be hosting a wriggling intestinal party inside. And it wasn't just worms. Fleas, mites, and bedbugs were likely part of daily Viking life too, especially in the thick fur bedding, animal hide cloaks, and thatched roof homes with warm, damp corners perfect for creepy crawlies. Even Viking ships, which were marvels of engineering, could become breeding grounds for pests. You've got damp wool, sweat, spilled food, and straw bedding packed into a wooden hull. Ideal conditions for parasites on a high seas holiday. But here's the thing. Vikings knew these pests existed, and they actively tried to fight back. They used herbs like wormwood, tansy, and yarrow to repel insects. These plants weren't just tossed around for decoration. They were hung in homes, burned for smoke, or even tucked into clothing. Some Norse sagas even mention fumigating longhouses, burning herbs to cleanse the space spiritually, and probably kill off bugs in the process. And for internal parasites, while they didn't understand microbiology, Viking healers known as Leiknir used a variety of herbal concoctions to treat illness, including what we now believe may have been anti-parasitic infusions. So yeah, even in the face of medieval biology's worst monsters, the Vikings weren't just lying down and scratching. They were itching, sure, but they were also fighting back with fire, smoke, sharp combs, and strong stomachs. It's important to remember that parasites were everywhere in the ancient world. The fact that Vikings took active physical steps to reduce lice and treat gut worms actually sets them ahead of many of their contemporaries. Compare that to parts of medieval Europe where some folks believed lice were God's punishment, and delousing was an act of vanity or sin. That kind of thinking kept people itchy and proud about it. Not the Vikings. They said, "This is gross. Get the comb." Okay, let's step back for a second. We've been deep diving into Viking hygiene. Grooming kits, weekly baths, linen underclothes, herbal oils, lice combs, and even a splash of fermented pea detergent. But here's the real question. Were the Vikings actually cleaner than everyone else in medieval Europe? Short answer, oh yes, by a landslide. Long answer, buckle up. Let's start with medieval England, where Vikings raided, traded, and eventually settled. The Anglo-Saxons did have some sense of cleanliness. There's evidence of combs, washing basins, and bathhouses, especially in monastic communities. But here's the thing, cleanliness was often tangled up with morality. Washing too frequently? That could be seen as prideful or worse, sinful. Some monks believed too much attention to personal grooming meant you were focusing too much on the body and not enough on the soul. And if there's one thing that didn't smell great in the 10th century, it was medieval morality. Now let's move over to medieval France, where personal hygiene was practically in a cold war with social norms. There are documented nobles who refused to bathe entirely, claiming it opened the pores and let disease in. Some believe that washing caused illness. There's even the legendary, though probably exaggerated, tale of Louis XIV, the Sun King himself, who supposedly bathed only twice in his entire life. And when he did, it was mostly to impress foreign dignitaries. Most of the time, he simply changed his clothing and powdered himself with perfume to hide the smell. Now let's go east. Byzantine culture, much more advanced in many ways, did value bathing. The Eastern Romans loved their bathhouses, carried on from ancient Roman tradition. But public bathhouses in Europe, especially in the West, declined fast after the fall of Rome. By the Viking Age, most of continental Europe had let hygiene go the way of the aqueduct. Compare that to Viking settlements like Jorvik, modern-day York, where archaeologists found latrines, drains, soapstone basins, combs, tweezers, and even purpose-built washing areas in homes. Some houses even had channels for draining gray water. Primitive, sure, but evidence of sanitation-minded design. Let's not forget the Arab world either. Travelers from the Islamic caliphates like Ibn Fadlan had very specific cleanliness rituals tied to religion. Daily washing for prayer, for example. So when he met the Norse on the Volga River in the 10th century, even he was surprised. Yes, he critiqued their group hand-washing and face-rinsing method. They reused water in one bowl, gross by today's standards. But he noted with interest that they did wash daily, combed their hair, and wore clean clothes with jewelry. So, compared to the broader medieval world, where people were wearing the same clothes for weeks, avoiding water like it was cursed, and dousing themselves in cologne to fight the rot, the Vikings were practically running a spa empire. What does all this say about Viking society? Were they just a bunch of pretty boy raiders flexing their beards and scented cloaks? Or was there something deeper going on? Turns out, Viking hygiene wasn't just about looking good. It was about discipline, respect, and order in a world that was often anything but. When you think about Viking life, sailing icy seas, enduring brutal winters, working the land, raiding foreign shores, it was tough. But amid that chaos, routine and ritual mattered. Grooming, bathing, laundering. It was how they reclaimed control, showed pride, and preserved status in a harsh, unpredictable world. A comb wasn't just for vanity, it told others, I take care of myself. I respect my home. I respect you. Bathing every Saturday? That wasn't just hygiene. It was a social expectation. A clean person was trustworthy, prepared, and honorable. Someone you could sit beside at the thing or share a drink with at a feast. Even spiritual belief was tied into cleanliness. You wanted to enter Valhalla looking sharp, not filthy and reeking of old goat. In death, as in life, the Vikings understood that appearance reflected identity, and that's where they might just be cleaner than a lot of us today. Because let's be honest, how many of us skip showers, live in hoodies we haven't washed in weeks, and think dry shampoo counts as self care? Vikings didn't have running water, but they had discipline. In a time with no germ theory, no antiseptics, no toothbrushes or plumbing, they still valued personal upkeep. Not because someone made them, but because it was part of who they were. So next time someone uses Viking as shorthand for being savage, barbaric, or filthy, just remember that long-haired Norseman probably bathed more in a month than a 14th century king did in his entire reign. So, what have we learned today? Well, for starters, Vikings weren't dirty, disgusting, unkempt barbarians. They were surprisingly invested in hygiene. They bathed weekly, combed their beards like runway models, filed their teeth for style points, and probably judged you very hard if you skipped wash day. Their grooming kits were more organized than most modern gym bags. Was it perfect? Nope. There were still fleas in the bed, guts leaking after axe fights, and onion breath-based diagnoses. But for the 9th century, the Vikings were like the spa influencers of the medieval world. So next time someone says, "You, Vikings must have been gross," hit them with the truth. They had combs, they had hot springs, they had soap. If you enjoyed this wild ride through Norse hygiene, do your own modern ritual. Like, subscribe, and leave a comment with your thoughts on their urine laundry routine. We've got more Viking weirdness, warrior wisdom, and ancient life hacks coming your way. Until next time, stay clean, stay sharp, and don't forget your ear spoon.